Welcome to the Bear Tour podcast. The reason that the audio is terrible is because this is a hairbrush, not a microphone. I'm surprised you didn't know that already. And I'm in my dorm room, so there will probably be hooligans passing through the hallway. I'm really sorry about that. Also, we have a tendency to have very loud motorcycles come at every single point in the day, including 3 a.m. So let's get started. Today I will be busting a myth that a true bilingual is somebody who speaks 2 languages perfectly. Now, I'll get into the nuances of this issue as time goes on, but first I would like to share a story with you. A student named Hong, he was talking about his experiences as a CLD learner and growing up, how he had a lot of negative interactions being a CLD learner and how that has affected him later in life. While sharing his stories, he really showcases the ignorance of some people because a lot of these stories are actually from his instructors that are talking to him this way, teachers, professors, people who he's supposed to be able to respect and respect him back and build that relationship. A quote from his instructor: "Hey, you Chinatown people, do not speak Chinese. English is the only language spoken in this class. If you want to speak Chinese, go to Chinatown in New York or San Francisco, because I do not want to hear Chinese. You understand? If you stay in Chinatown, you will never get a chance to practice English. Eventually, the language you speak is Chinglish, not authentic English. You understand?" That is a crazy thing to say. I don't really have any more nuance to add to this other than just pointing out the fact that this is not a unique experience. And I don't mean to diminish his experience in any way. However, CLD learners across the globe, not just in America, but as we'll see later on in places like Australia, experience this a lot. Just the disrespect, not only from teachers, but also from peers, and it really just adds to social othering, and it makes it really hard for them to establish connections wherever they are. I'd like to pull one more quote from the same article, which all of the articles that I'll mention today, I will have on a sheet that you can check out. I really encourage you to read these if you have the time, even if it's just a skim. They're really, really important, and they talk a lot more professionally than I can. So yeah, definitely check those out if you can. This is also a quote from Hong when he was talking about his experiences in school. He talked a lot about the shame and humiliation that his teachers projected on him whenever he was in school. And he said, "I told the instructor that I do not understand him and asked him if he could speak slowly. He did not say anything. He did not even look at me. I also reported the issue to one of the administrations in the ELI, but nothing had changed. I do not think he cares about us. He might have seen us as chairs, desks, or some sort of things, because he does not care if we understand or not." I couldn't imagine being belittled like this, not even being acknowledged by your teacher, who you are going out of your way to be vulnerable with by asking them to slow down, because it's really important to include scaffoldings or just extra support for people who are trying to learn English or whatever language. This can include simple things like slowing down your speech, repeating instructions, gesturing, and it's not very difficult to include this in your lesson. So the fact that he was disrespected like this in a academic institution is quite frankly unacceptable. Like I mentioned before, unfortunately, this is not a unique experience. This scenario has played out thousands of times, probably just today, by people who have no idea what it's like to learn a second language. And I'm talking about the United States, because we don't really prioritize second language acquisition, because the rest of the world does a really great job at learning English. So it's been deprioritized in the United States, unfortunately, and it's not valued in schools. I personally only took about 2 years of high school Spanish because that is all that was required of me. But yeah, so like I said, today I will be going over the struggles of bilinguals, more specifically in America, but also in general, and trying to debunk the fact that in order to be considered bilingual, you have to speak 2 languages perfectly. Truly, the main issue with this myth is just that last word, perfectly, because as Hannah Montana once said, everybody makes mistakes. The way I decided to structure this podcast / video essay is by focusing a lot on Ouida and CMAS standards for CLD students, to talk about what it really means to be fluent in a language, to speak a language perfectly. So for this issue, I will be breaking it down into 3 main categories. First, starting off with grammatical accuracy, and then moving on to listening, comprehension, and the final boss, pronunciation and accents. To start off, me and you are going to talk about grammatical accuracy. Did you even notice that what I just said was grammatically incorrect? I bet you didn't, because it sounds a lot more natural than saying, you and I will be getting started with the first topic of grammatical accuracy. That sounds robotic. It's not the way I talk. It's not the way that most native English speakers talk. And that honestly goes for a lot of different languages. Most native speakers don't follow grammatical structures to the T 100% every day. I personally, whenever I'm talking about going to the mall with my friends, I say, hey, me and my friends are going to the mall. I don't say my friends and I. And though my English teacher would disagree, this is a perfectly acceptable way to talk. When talking about speaking with grammatical accuracy, I will mainly be going on the lens that CLD speakers are expected to speak 100% accurately all the time. Now, I won't go so far as to claim that we should abolish our entire English teaching practices. I was taught academic English in school, and I do think that this is an important tool to use for CLD learners, especially when it comes to taking tests, because the Ouida and the CMAS standards are so high that teaching academic language is super important to equip these students with the ability to actually take these tests and comprehend the questions that they're being asked. However, I think that bad grammar should be assessed in the way that it's punished, especially just talking in a casual way. I don't see why there's any punishment if there is understanding between both groups. For instance, in the Spanish language, you normally say the adjective before the verb. Is vacuuming. Okay, they've been vacuuming for a full 10 minutes. I'm not really sure when they're going to stop, and like I said, I really apologize for the audio quality. I'm not a professional. Anyways, on the topic to what extent we should not necessarily punish but correct bad grammar, I would like to direct you to one of the known as the Tower of Babel podcast. Heather Hansen featured on this podcast. She talks about how the level of understanding really goes down when a native speaker is there. This is because we use kind of weird idioms to express what we mean. Specifically, she talks about the term keep in touch and how strange that might sound to a non-native English speaker who doesn't really know what that means, because if you look at the words individually, it kind of signals that there's going to be physical contact, and this is a professional environment, so overall this is just kind of a strange thing to say. And her lesson of the podcast is that because English is so outpaced by English learners, and what I mean by that is native speakers of English, the numbers come out to around 4 million. She says so in her podcast. I did double check this, and most of her numbers are pretty accurate. But anyways, those number about 4 million, and the number of English learners almost total to 2 billion, which is a crazy ratio. So if the amount of people overall that speak English are more than the native speakers, then how can we expect communications to go well if we aren't adjusting anything about the way we speak to those who don't have English as their first language and might not understand all these strange cultural references? Like I mentioned before, scaffolding is a tactic in when you structure your speech and or classroom to help CLD learners. This can really easily be applied to talking to global peers, colleagues, students, and like I mentioned before, this can just mean simplifying your English, not include super niche references, talking more slowly and trying to enunciate your words. I would like to preface that this is not in an infantilizing way. This tactic is super helpful for anybody trying to acquire a language. I'm trying to learn Spanish right now, and the app that I use has a feature where you can slow down how fast they talk because I'm not used to Spanish, and so whenever I'm listening to it, I kind of need them to go slow, at least right now, until I reach that level of proficiency. So this is in no way to disrespect higher ups. It's just respectful for people who don't speak English and are trying to communicate with you. Also, on the topic of grammatical accuracy, I would like to introduce you to what Ebonics are if you aren't already familiar. Ebonics, otherwise known as African American English, is not a vernacular, and it is in fact an entire new language. It follows the structures of a normal language. However, we see it constantly disregarded in school as a lesser or subcategory of English. A lot of white people label it as slang, and this is likely because they don't actually know what it means and they feel left out, so they want to punish it. There will actually be a dictionary coming out of African American English, so that's super cool. Anyways, on this subject, even though it is classified as a language, I would actually like to talk about code switching. This is a tactic of whitening yourself to meet a standard, because if you aren't familiar, white supremacy is actually ingrained in every single part of society. This is not just in the United States, it's worldwide, and it is ever raging on, especially with some people in power right now. Anyways, research has shown that people in professional settings, Black people in professional settings, have used this tactic of code switching to differ the way they talk, switching from Ebonics to standard English, to kind of appeal to peers and not face so much racial scrutiny. From the research that I gathered, it's mostly to make white people comfortable with them, and it's used to advance socially, professionally, because whether it's subconscious or not, there is plenty of discrimination, not only in the workplace, but in schools, and this subconscious or conscious bias can lead these very qualified professionals and students to not get job opportunities, raises, be taken into gifted and talented programs, or even just in a classroom setting, that is, just be neglected by their teacher. Maybe they aren't putting in as much care if their students are talking in AAE, because if the teacher is already categorizing it within their brain as a subgenre or lesser English, then they might underestimate their students and not put in as much effort to get that student the resources they need. If you are interested in this issue, please see McCloney's article, but why read that when you can listen to our special guest? Please welcome Miss Kaya Johnson. This is our special guest.
Hi everybody, I'm Kaya Johnson. I am a first year and I'm gonna major in poli-sci and minor in philosophy.
Hey, I'm here to ask you, we just talked a bit about code switching and how this is related to CLD learners, and I just wanted to know some of your personal experience with when, where, and why you have code switched in present or past.
Yeah, so I think I grew up in a pretty diverse community, so I didn't really have to code switch too often. But I think since coming to CC, it's become more of, I guess, an everyday kind of thing. I think my first experience was definitely in my FYP. Yeah, I went
Which
to.
we had together.
We had that together, and it was a white supremacy class, you know?
Yeah, it was talking a lot about linguistic racism, which
Yeah.
I've mentioned a little bit about, and it was a very interesting crew.
Definitely.
Yeah.
A very interesting experience. But I think originally when I first went in there, I was very much myself, not so much code switching, but I realized very early on, in order to be taken seriously, I was gonna have to code switch. And I think a lot of times code switching, people perceive that as just language, but it's so much more than that. It's clothes, it's actions and behaviors. So I think, first of all, the first thing I switched was obviously my language. I did not use AAE in there at all, because I noticed when I did, people thought it was okay to speak to me that way. And that's not okay.
Sorry,
please do not. Yeah, don't do that. So I think that was the first thing I changed, and that's kind of like just immediate reaction almost. It's like a safety net when you feel that using your language that you've been taught or normalized in, you know, your culture and your experience is not safe anymore, then you just switch to something where you feel is more safe.
Has this mostly been with like students or teachers?
I would say more so with students. You know, teachers definitely try their best to be accepting. I think, and if they are saying something that's a bit racially insensitive, a lot of times it is not intentional. But students, you know, you never really know.
Yeah.
And I think code switching has become, yes, a form of protection, but also in a way just trying to show people, do not talk to me that way. I've had quite a few people come up to me and be like, hey sis, I'm not your sis. So don't.
So stop
yeah.
right there.
Immediately stop
yeah.
and don't use that. So yeah.
I was wondering, I know we've talked a little bit, like just me personally, about how like this has created like a like psychological effect. For context, our institution is a predominantly white one. I think like it's something like 96 or like 98% of the student body is white. So I think this like, I don't know, obviously it depends on where you live, but what's been the most like bothersome thing on campus when it comes to people like being insensitive about like race?
I think two things are tied kind of neck and neck.
Okay.
The first thing I would say is people treating me like I'm dumb. I'm not dumb. Obviously, if I'm here, I'm not dumb.
16% acceptance rate.
Yeah.
It was mentioning like Ebonics is, or African American English, is a language, and a lot of people label it as like AAVE, a vernacular English, and I think that really like in people's minds lets them accept like, oh, this is like a lesser form of English somehow, and I think that comes from like white people not understanding what's going on.
I think referring to it as a vernacular is a bit of a problem because, like you just mentioned, it then becomes perceived as a lesser English when it's not necessarily that. And it's a language in itself, and it builds so much culture and relationships just like so many other languages. So yeah, it's not a vernacular.
Yeah.
It's a language. That's important to say.
Oh, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. Everybody say thank you, Kyle.
Thank you guys.
Yay! Okay, that was super great. If there was a lighting change, I definitely didn't record it at a different time because Kaya is busy right now at the time of recording. Moving on. This strategy of code switching in order to appeal to the dominant society is very closely connected to immigrants and honestly anybody with an accent that would be considered foreign, in the United States at least, who would like to undergo accent reduction therapy. Basically kind of like speech therapy in schools, but it's specifically to Americanize your English. Bilinguals feel the pressure to do this because of society's outlook on them. Like I'll show later on, this can be seen in media where Spanish accents are used to kind of humor. Bilinguals will undergo this accent reduction therapy to appeal to higher ups and teachers, much like Black students do with code switching. And while AAE differs from standard English much less than Spanish, it is a language all on its own, and this use of code switching and accent reduction for bilinguals are used for the same survival purposes. That's my signal for the fact that we're changing topics. Our next category is listening comprehension. Because I'm talking about perfecting or being completely fluent in two languages, this is a really important category when addressing CLD learners. When learning a language, obviously you want to be able to understand what you're hearing. Duh. However, this brick of the perfect language house that we are trying to break down is a little bit tougher to crack. It's a very important skill when learning any language, and even if you're too scared to speak it, because speaking is a very vulnerable thing, especially when we're talking about American culture and the ridicule that a lot of CLD learners get for having some sort of accent or not getting their grammar perfect. Honing in on the classroom environment, a lot of students are kind of left in the background because they don't understand what their teachers are saying. I've witnessed a lot of really helpful things, Like, one of the schools that I observed had a live translation on the board, but this is still not enough scaffolding to ensure understanding for CLD students. You really need to slow down your speech and incorporate those scaffolds that can be grown. I personally am really bad at listening. We were talking about Ouida testing standards and how a section of the test is just read off. The students are not allowed to read it, and I don't believe it's allowed to be repeated. I don't think I would be able to answer half of these verbal questions because I have ADHD. I need to read it, I need to see it, because adding that context really helps. And that doesn't make me an English speaker. So why would that declassify somebody else as a bilingual speaker just because they might be more or less proficient for various reasons in the listening category? And when it comes to comprehension of non-native English speakers trying to understand native English speakers, in a moment I'm going to show you very professionally by holding up my laptop to the screen a clip from a show called Modern Family. In this show, this type of linguistic racism, and I would like to refer to it as that because it is a violent act. It's very harmful psychologically. This example of linguistic racism is framed as a lighthearted joke. Eventually, rocks wither.
You know how frustrating it is to have to translate everything in my head before I say it? To have people laugh in my face because I'm struggling to find the words? You should try talking in my shoes from 1 mile.
I think you meant...
I know what I meant to mean. Do you even know how smart I am in Spanish? Of course you don't. For once, it would be nice to speak to someone in my own language, in my own home.
This struggle is a common sentiment that many bilinguals share. I think the main issue is that in the United States, we don't prioritize learning a different language, so we don't really understand the difficulties, and there's not as much overall empathy for learners of English. It can be really difficult to socialize and really motivate yourself to try to more deeply understand the people around you, because like Gloria in her house, nobody's making an effort to understand your language. So how would you try? When I was looking up the criteria for CLD students, pronunciation, a lot of people described it as sounding like a native speaker. The issue with that is there are a lot of places where English is their native language. So what does sounding like a native speaker even mean? Is that having a British accent, an Australian one, a Southern accent, a Northern accent? Even within the States, there's so many different types of dialects and accents. So I don't understand how there can possibly be a right way to speak English. And this connects even further back to the amount of English learners, my bad, versus native English speakers. We're outnumbered 1 to 5, if you did the math earlier. Then how can we really say what's right and wrong? One moment that really made this issue of having students ridiculed for whatever accent they may have was during Dr. Anya's speech, when she told us about a class study on several different groups of college students that were shown the exact same audio clip. There was no modification. It was the same audio clip. One of the groups was shown a picture of a woman of Asian descent. That group did detect a Chinese accent, where the other group, who was just shown a white woman with brown hair, detected no accent. Curious. What do you have to say about this? Not on camera. And Dr. Anya also pointed out this kind of fake issue of people having an accent whenever they're learning English, because regionally we don't punish accents. Like, I was never punished in school for saying grandma instead of grandma or grandmother. I don't know. Anyways, a lot of my friends tell me that I have a Southern accent. I am putting on my academic voice right now, so you might not have noticed it. Honestly, to me, it's not an accent because that's where I grew up and that's what's familiar to me. So in reality, an accent, as Dr. Anya explained, is more just a reflection of your expectations and how you think a word should be pronounced. And when people differ from that, than you perceive an accent. If you do have an accent, and for example, if you have a Spanish accent, like this was one of the clips that I saw of Gloria whenever I was looking for that one. She was saying Luke instead of look. And the only reason that she was misunderstood was because in the context of the scene, she couldn't be, her body language wasn't shown. But yeah, like even if you do have an accent, whether it's a Southern or Spanish or Irish accent, it's normally solved by just adding context. I make a lot of gestures whenever I'm talking to be better understood, and also because I'm a fidgety person. But yeah, if you can understand the other person and there's communication between you two, I don't see why there's an issue. Punishing accents is honestly just another form of linguistic racism, and it's just another tactic that's used by white people to discriminate against those who aren't and they detect as different or foreign. I mean, even in a study that I saw that, again, is linked below, where in Australia, international students, even like white kids from America with American accents, were like made fun of by their peers, and this really affected them socially. They couldn't really socialize and make these connections. They were self-isolating because they felt inferior to their peers. I don't know if it just wasn't detected by teachers, but during lunchtime they were constantly like poked and prodded and asked to say things and laughed at, and that takes a really big toll, especially on young minds. When there being so many different dialects, not just within the United States but globally, there cannot possibly be a perfect accent. It can't happen. The world has never been able to agree on anything. When it comes to speaking a language perfectly, in the standards, it includes pronunciation and all these different other factors that I've mentioned. But as I have brought you along with me, and thank you for being here, by the way, perfection doesn't exist in any of these categories. So realistically, you can't speak a language perfectly, even your own native language, which means that bilingualism and labeling yourself as someone who is bilingual is honestly pretty subjective. I would say that most people that speak two languages really hesitate to call themselves a bilingual person. If you're traveling abroad and you ask someone, hey, do you speak English? They'll probably say, a little bit, and then give you a sentence in English that's perfectly comprehensible and very helpful. So thanks, guys. Like I've said before, learning a language and speaking one is honestly a very vulnerable process. And this is mainly due to the stigma in certain places of feeling like you need to be a perfectionist, especially in the United States, feeling like you need to be a perfectionist just to qualify as a bilingual person. Break down these boundaries, we can do like the Tower of Babel suggests, and kind of reconsider what really is good and bad English. So honestly, my main advice is just keep an open mind, do some research, and learn a language. It's awesome. It's fun. It's scary, but it's super helpful, and it can lead you to make friends and travel and have a lot of skills that you didn't have before. So I hope I was able to bust this language myth, as well as expose some issues and struggles that bilingual people go through. Stay beautiful, be kind, and I will see you on the next episode. Goodbye.